No secretary ever survived 2 weeks working for the most ruthless mafia boss in New York, until a clumsy, desperate young woman with nothing left to lose showed up and turned his dark empire upside down. Nora Sullivan was already late, which in her mind meant she should at least walk in with some dignity. Too bad her skirt kept sliding sideways. Her heel had a piece of paper from the subway stuck to it, and her eyes were still red from crying all night over the hospital bills she couldn't pay. Great start. When she pushed the glass door a little too hard, the receptionist choked on her espresso. Nora blurted out that she was Nora Sullivan here for the executive assistant interview at 10. And yes, she knew it was already 10:23. And yes, the subway broke down. And yes, she got the building name wrong twice. And yes, she spilled coffee on her resume, but you could still read most of it. And yes, her mascara was probably smudged because her mother was dying and her ex-boyfriend just stole everything she had, but none of that mattered because she really, really needed this job. She said it all in one breath while adjusting her skirt and peeling the paper off her shoe. Gina, the receptionist, just blinked like she was watching a video on fast forward, then said that Mr. Moretti did not tolerate lateness, and also he did not tolerate desperation, and also he did not tolerate people who talked too much. Nora smiled and replied that perfect because she did not tolerate slippery door handles or judgy receptionists or men who thought they were scary so they were even. Gina's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Nobody talked like that about Dante Moretti. Nobody. But Nora Sullivan was about to walk straight into his office, and she had no idea what was waiting for her. Like and subscribe if you want to see what happens when the devil meets the one woman who isn't afraid of him. 5 minutes later, Gina led Nora to the black oak door at the end of the corridor on the 32nd floor. The receptionist knocked twice, short and precise, then called inside that the applicant had arrived. A low voice, cold as ice, came from within. Just one word, "Come in." Gina pushed the door open and stepped aside, her gaze on Nora as if she were watching a lamb walk into a wolf's den. Nora drew a deep breath and crossed the threshold. The room was so vast she could have fit her shabby apartment inside it 3 times over. Glass walls looked out over all of Manhattan. Dark leather and walnut wood filled the space. Everything radiating power and danger, but all of it faded beside the man seated behind the massive desk at the center of the room. Dante Moretti. He wore a perfectly tailored 3-piece black suit, black hair slicked back, features sharp and cold as if carved from marble. But what nearly made Nora forget how to breathe were his eyes, storm gray like a winter tempest, cold and piercing as if they could see through every layer she was trying to build around herself. He didn't look up at her, just kept reviewing a stack of documents in front of him while saying she was 23 minutes late. Lipstick on her teeth, mascara smudged, and her resume looked like it had been pulled out of a trash can. Nora swallowed. She ran her tongue over her teeth to check the lipstick and replied that yes, that was true. And she also noticed he had a coffee stain on his shirt cuff. So perhaps neither of them was perfect this morning. Dante stopped turning the pages. He looked up at her for the first time, that cold gray gaze locking onto hers as if trying to read every thought in her head. The silence stretched for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Nora felt like prey under a predator's watch, but she didn't allow herself to tremble. She'd cried enough last night. She'd been afraid enough for 27 years of her life. Today, she had nothing left to lose. Dante set the papers down and said her resume showed she'd been fired 5 times in 2 years, hadn't finished college, had no experience as a secretary, and her only reference was a priest in Brooklyn. Nora nodded and confirmed yes, 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 and yes, and added that she also had a talent for spilling coffee on everything important if he wanted to add that to the list. Something flickered in Dante's eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe amusement. Nora wasn't sure. He asked why she wanted this job. Nora was going to lie, to say the usual lines about passion for corporate environments or career growth or whatever interviewers wanted to hear. But looking into those cold eyes, she knew he'd see through every lie. So she told the truth. She said her mother was dying of stage 3 cancer and needed surgery within 48 hours, or she'd die. The cost was $250,000, and she had exactly $2,300 in her bank account. Her boyfriend of 4 years had emptied $70,000 of her savings and vanished. She owed 3 months of rent and was about to be evicted. She had a blind old cat that was the only thing left of her late father. And she needed this job not because she wanted it, but because she had no other choice. She added that he didn't have to hire her. That was his right, but at least he wouldn't be hiring her for a lie instead of the truth. The room fell so silent Nora could hear her own heartbeat. Dante stared at her for a long 10 seconds. Then he said something she hadn't expected at all. He said every applicant before her had told him what they thought he wanted to hear. All of them were false. All of them were so afraid of him they couldn't even meet his eyes. Nora replied that she didn't have time to be afraid and didn't have the energy to be false, and maybe that was why she'd been fired 5 times. Dante let out a quiet laugh, short and dry, but still a laugh. Outside the door, Gina nearly dropped her phone because in 3 years of working there she'd never heard Dante Moretti laugh. He stood up, nearly a head taller than Nora, walked around the desk, and stopped less than a meter from her. He said the position was a 2-week trial. If she survived, she stayed. If not, she left. And he added that here, survive wasn't a figure of speech. Nora lifted her chin and looked straight into his eyes, and asked if he was trying to scare her. Dante tilted his head slightly, the gray still icy but with something else glinting within it. He said he was warning her. Nora smiled and asked what time she started. Dante looked at her for another moment, then returned to his desk and said 8 tomorrow morning. Don't be late. Nora nodded and turned toward the door. Just as she touched the handle, Dante's voice came from behind her. He said she had an ink stain on the back of her skirt. Nora looked down, sighed, and said, "Great. One more thing for the list of the worst day of her life." She walked out without looking back. Inside the office, Dante Moretti slowly turned his pen between his fingers, his eyes still fixed on the door where Nora had disappeared. For the first time in many years, someone had made him curious. And in his world, curiosity was something very, very dangerous. The next morning, Nora Sullivan stepped into the lobby of Moretti Holdings at 7:59, 1 minute early. She'd woken at 5, checked the subway schedule 3 times, prepared 2 outfits in case she spilled coffee, and arrived at the station 40 minutes early just to be sure nothing could make her late. Gina sat behind the reception desk and looked up at her with a mix of surprise and suspicion, as if she couldn't quite believe Nora had actually come back. Nora smiled at her and walked to the elevator. Inside were 2 employees whispering to each other who fell silent when they saw her. A middle-aged man in a gray suit looked her up and down, then murmured to his colleague that this must be the new secretary. Poor thing. The woman beside him nodded and said, "Did he remember Amanda? She'd lasted 3 weeks, and then cried in the bathroom for the last 5 days. The man said, "What about Patricia?" 2 weeks, and then she emailed her resignation at 2 in the morning. The record was still Susan, 6 days. She'd run out of the building at lunchtime and never come back. The woman added that there were rumors Susan had needed therapy for 6 months after that. Nora stood still and didn't turn around, pretending she hadn't heard anything, though her stomach twisted into a knot. The elevator stopped on the 32nd floor, and she stepped out, leaving the whispering behind her. Her desk stood directly in front of Dante's office door like a guard post or a trench on a battlefield. She glanced at Dante's schedule and saw meetings stacked back to back from 8 in the morning to 9 at night. No breaks, no gaps, as if the man didn't need to eat or breathe. She began organizing the towering pile of files on her desk into a new color system. Red for urgent matters that needed immediate attention, yellow for things important that day, green for items that could wait until the weekend, and gray for things that could wait until the end of the world without anyone caring. She was placing a label on the 12th folder when a shadow fell across her desk. Nora looked up and saw a tall man standing in front of her. He was around 40, with neatly cut salt and pepper hair, an angular face, and a faint scar running from his temple down to his left cheekbone. His eyes were cold and sharp as blades, studying her without disguise. He introduced himself as Marco Santini, Dante's right-hand man, and said he needed to speak with her. Nora nodded and asked about what. Marco stepped closer, his voice lowered so only the 2 of them could hear. He said he didn't know who she was, didn't know where she came from, and didn't care about whatever sad story she'd told Dante. The only thing he cared about was loyalty. He went on to say that if she betrayed Dante, if she spied for anyone, if she revealed anything she saw or heard here, he'd handle her personally. And he added, his tone cold as ice, that he was very good at handling problems. Nora met Marco's eyes without blinking and said she understood. And she also wanted to be clear that she was here to work, not to cause trouble. And if he was trying to scare her, he should know she'd faced loan sharks, a con artist boyfriend, and $250,000 in hospital bills. So a scar on his face didn't frighten her. Marco studied her for a few more seconds. Then one corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but no longer entirely hostile. He said she had guts and turned away. Nora let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The first day had barely begun, and she'd already been threatened with death. This really was an interesting job. 15 minutes after her encounter with Marco, the phone on Nora's desk began ringing nonstop. She picked it up and tried to keep her voice professional as she said, "This is Moretti Holdings. This is Nora. How may I help you?" A warm, low male voice came through the line, introducing himself as Richardson, from Richardson and Associates, and saying he needed to speak urgently with Dante about the Newark port contract. Nora stared at the phone console with its dozens of buttons, more complicated than a spaceship control panel, and began pressing at random. She heard beeps, then silence, then more beeps. Finally, she thought she'd transferred the call successfully and let out a breath of relief. 2 minutes later, Dante stepped out of his office with an icy expression and asked why Richardson had called the kitchen department to ask about a $50 million contract. Nora's mouth fell open, and she stammered that she was sorry, that the phone system had more buttons than a piano, and she was still learning. Dante looked at her with a gaze that could freeze hell itself and said Richardson was their most important partner in the Newark port deal. A deal that could decide the future of Moretti Holdings for the next 5 years. Nora swallowed and promised it wouldn't happen again. She'd barely finished speaking when the elevator doors opened, and a man in his early 30s wearing jeans and a leather jacket stepped out. He said he was a courier from a law office and had urgent documents that needed a signature for receipt. Nora looked at him, then at the thick folder in his hands. She asked what it was, and he replied that it was confidential paperwork on the Newark port deal that required an authorized signature. Nora thought that she was the secretary, and signing for documents must be part of her job, so she took the pen and signed Nora Sullivan on the line at the bottom of the first page. The man nodded his thanks and disappeared into the elevator. 10 minutes later, Dante came out again and asked if anyone had delivered documents. Nora handed him the folder with a proud expression because this time she'd done the right thing. Dante opened it, flipped through a few pages, then suddenly stopped. His face changed and his voice dropped to something dangerous as he asked where she'd signed. Nora pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the first page and said she'd signed there, right under the recipient line. Dante closed his eyes for a second, as if restraining his temper, then said the man who'd delivered the documents wasn't an ordinary courier, that he was David Morrison, a senior lawyer from Morrison & Associates, and that this was confidential material on the Newark port deal, and she'd just signed as a company representative without authority. Nora felt the blood drain from her face and stammered that she was sorry, that he'd been wearing jeans and a leather jacket. How was she supposed to know he was a lawyer? Dante was about to say something, probably to fire her on the spot, but his eyes suddenly caught on a page in the folder. He went silent, read more closely, flipped to another page, then back again. Nora stood still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the death sentence on her very short career. Dante suddenly looked up and asked exactly which line she'd signed. Nora's hand shook as she pointed, and Dante followed her finger, then let out a dry laugh. He said she'd just done what his team of lawyers, paid $500 an hour, hadn't been able to do for 2 months. Nora blinked, confused, and asked what she'd done. Dante explained that by signing on exactly that line on exactly that page, she'd accidentally activated a hidden clause in the contract that the other side's legal team had deliberately buried. That clause allowed Moretti Holdings to renegotiate the entire deal on more favorable terms. He looked at her with an unreadable expression and said she'd just saved the company $50 million. Nora stared and stammered that she'd done something good. Dante replied that this time she had, but next time she should ask before signing anything. He turned back toward his office, but before closing the door, he glanced back and added that her color-coded filing system seemed to be working. Nora didn't know whether that was a compliment or a warning, but she decided to take it as a small victory. 3 days after the legal loophole incident, Nora began to think that maybe this job wasn't as bad as she'd imagined. She'd gotten used to the complicated phone system, no longer misdirected calls, and even Marco nodded to her each morning instead of looking at her like an enemy. But that evening, everything changed. Nora stayed late to finish the financial report Dante wanted the next morning. The clock read 9:45 at night when she stood up from her desk to get some water. The 32nd floor was deserted, lit only by the glow from Dante's office seeping through the crack under the door. As she passed the small auxiliary conference room at the end of the corridor, she heard strange sounds coming from inside. Groans, impacts, and a low, threatening voice. Nora knew she should turn away, knew she shouldn't be curious, knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but her feet didn't listen to reason. She crept closer to the door, which was slightly ajar, and looked inside. What she saw made the blood in her veins freeze. A man was tied to a chair, his face swollen and bleeding, one eye almost unable to open. Dante stood in front of him, his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, and in his hand was a glossy black gun. Marco stood beside him, his expression cold as stone. Dante asked in a low, measured voice for the last time who had paid him to sell information about the Newark port deal to Benedetti. The bound man sobbed and begged for forgiveness, saying he'd had no choice. They'd threatened his family. Dante tilted his head and asked whether he'd chosen to betray the man who'd fed him for 10 years. Then Dante raised the gun. Nora clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming, but her elbow struck the water jug on the shelf by the door. It fell to the floor with a loud clatter that rang through the silence. Everything froze. Dante turned his head, his cold gray eyes locking on the crack in the door where Nora stood. She wanted to run, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. The door flew open and Marco appeared, one hand grabbing Nora's arm and dragging her into the room. He shoved her into a chair, pulled out his gun, and aimed it straight at her head. Marco looked at Dante and said she'd seen everything. They had to deal with her. Nora trembled but tried to keep her voice steady as she said she'd only gone to get water. She hadn't seen anything. She swore she wouldn't tell anyone. Marco laughed coldly and said that was what they all said before they started talking. Dante stood still, his eyes never leaving Nora. He asked what she'd seen. Nora understood that lying would be a death sentence, so she told the truth. She said she'd seen him interrogating a man tied to a chair. She'd seen blood. She'd seen a gun. And she guessed the man had betrayed him by selling information to someone named Benedetti. Marco tightened his grip on the gun and repeated that she knew too much. They couldn't let her go. Dante lifted a hand, signaling Marco to stop. He stepped closer to Nora, so close she could smell expensive cologne mixed with gunpowder. He asked if she was afraid. Nora looked up, her eyes meeting his, and answered in a trembling voice but without backing down that she was afraid. Very afraid. But if he was going to kill her, she had one request. Dante asked what. Nora said let her make one call to her mother first. Let her tell her she loved her, and let her transfer this week's pay to the hospital before she died. The room went so silent it felt suffocating. Marco looked at Nora with a baffled expression, as if he couldn't believe someone facing death was thinking about hospital bills. Dante studied her for a long minute, then turned to Marco and said in a voice that couldn't be argued with that she wasn't to be touched, that from now on she'd be in his sight 24/7, and if anyone touched a single hair on her head, that person would answer to him. Marco opened his mouth to protest, but one sharp look from Dante silenced him. He lowered his gun and stepped back. Dante turned back to Nora and said that from now on she'd know more than she wanted to know. But that also meant she couldn't leave. Not now. Maybe not ever. Nora swallowed and asked if that meant he was imprisoning her or employing her. Dante looked at her with an unreadable expression and said he was protecting her, whether she realized it or not. The next morning, Nora didn't know how she was supposed to behave when she walked into the office. She hadn't slept all night. The image of the bloodied man tied to a chair and the glossy black gun in Dante's hand haunting her every time she closed her eyes. But she still arrived at 8 because she had no other choice. Her mother still needed surgery money. The hospital bills were still piling up, and now she couldn't quit even if she wanted to. She'd been at her desk barely 5 minutes when Dante's office door opened. He stood in the doorway and signaled her in with a nod. Nora took a deep breath and stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click like the lock of a cage. Dante sat down and pointed to the chair across from him, ordering her to sit. Nora sat, her hands on her lap to hide their trembling. Dante watched her in silence for a long minute, then asked how she felt after last night. Nora answered honestly that she hadn't slept and she was still trying to process the fact that her boss was a mafia boss who tortured people in the conference room. Dante raised an eyebrow and asked if she was afraid of him. Nora thought for a moment and said she was afraid. She wasn't crazy enough not to be afraid of a man with a gun, but she also understood that the man had betrayed him, and in his world betrayal had a price. Dante tilted his head, studying her with curiosity, and asked if she wasn't judging him. Nora said she had no right to judge anyone. She was just a girl trying to save her mother, and she'd seen enough darkness in her life to know the world wasn't always clearly black and white. Dante was silent for a moment, then asked something that surprised her. He asked about her father. Nora stiffened and said her father had died 15 years ago, killed in a robbery. At least that was what the police had told her mother. Dante nodded slowly as if filing that away, then asked about her ex-boyfriend who'd stolen $70,000. Nora wondered why he cared, but answered that his name was Tyler Brooks. They'd been together 4 years. She'd thought he loved her, but it turned out she was just a fool who trusted too easily. Dante said nothing more, only nodded and signaled that she could go. Nora stood and walked to the door. But before she opened it, Dante added that from now on, someone would be watching and protecting her 24/7. Not to imprison her, but to keep her safe, because now she knew too much, and there were people who would want to exploit that. Nora turned back and asked who those people were. Dante replied coldly that she'd know when she needed to know. Nora stepped out and closed the door behind her. She didn't know that the moment she left, Dante picked up the phone, called Marco, and ordered a full investigation into Nora Sullivan's past, from her father's death 15 years earlier to every last detail about Tyler Brooks, and he wanted the results within 48 hours. 2 days after the conversation in Dante's office, Nora was sitting at her desk organizing the meeting schedule for the coming week when her personal phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and saw the number from Brooklyn Presbyterian Hospital. Her heart tightened as she answered. A woman's voice on the other end asked if she was Nora Sullivan, the next of kin of Catherine Sullivan. Nora said yes, and asked what was wrong. The voice told her that her mother had collapsed at home and had been found by a neighbor and taken to the emergency room. Her condition was very serious. The tumor had grown faster than expected and was pressing on vital organs. The doctors said she needed surgery within 48 hours or they couldn't guarantee she would survive. Nora felt the world spinning around her. She asked in a trembling voice how much it would cost. The woman paused, then said that with such a complex operation plus recovery and medication, the total would be around $250,000, and they needed at least $100,000 as a deposit before proceeding. Nora couldn't speak. She had $2,300 in her account. She didn't even have a tenth of what they were asking. The woman asked if she'd heard, and Nora stammered that she understood, that she'd try to arrange it. She hung up and sat frozen at her desk. Her hands shook so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. Her mother was dying. Her mother was dying, and she had no money to save her. Nora stood, her feet moving without direction. She didn't know where she was going until she found herself in the women's restroom at the end of the hall. She locked the door, leaned against the wall, and slowly slid down to the floor. Then she cried. She cried like she never had before, her sobs echoing in the small room. She cried because her mother was dying alone in a hospital bed. She cried because she'd worked herself raw for 10 years and still didn't have enough to save the person she loved most. She cried because Tyler had taken everything she had. She cried because life was so unfair and she was exhausted. Nora didn't know how long she stayed there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe half an hour. When she opened the door and stepped out, her eyes swollen and her face flushed, she nearly collided with Dante, standing just outside. He looked at her with an unreadable expression and asked what had happened. Nora was going to lie, to say nothing was wrong, but she had no strength left to pretend. She answered hoarsely that her mother needed surgery within 48 hours, that it cost $250,000, and she didn't have the money. Her mother was dying, and she could do nothing. Dante said nothing. He just looked at her for a few seconds, then turned and walked away, leaving Nora alone in the corridor with her heart in pieces. She thought he didn't care. She thought he was as cold as everyone said. She went back to her desk and started searching for charities, medical aid programs, anything that might help her raise that impossible amount. 2 hours later, her phone rang again. It was Brooklyn Presbyterian Hospital. She answered with a heavy heart, ready to hear the worst. But the woman's voice on the line delivered something completely unexpected. She said that the entire cost of Catherine Sullivan's surgery and treatment had been paid in full an hour earlier. Dr. Samuel Chen, one of the best surgeons in the city, had been arranged to perform the operation the next morning. Nora's mouth fell open, and she asked who had paid. The woman said the person had requested to remain anonymous, but they could say it was a transfer from Moretti Holdings. Nora let the phone fall onto her desk. She turned and looked toward Dante's office, where the black oak door was still closed. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time not from despair. Nora sat motionless, staring at the phone on her desk for 5 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. $250,000. Dante Moretti had just spent $250,000 to save her mother, a woman he'd never even met. She stood, her legs slightly unsteady, and walked toward the black oak door. She didn't knock. She pushed straight in. Something she knew broke every rule, but she didn't care now. Dante was sitting behind his desk, a phone to his ear, speaking to someone in Italian. He looked up at her with irritation at being interrupted, but Nora didn't stop. She walked straight up to his desk and stood there, tears still on her cheeks, her voice trembling as she said she knew what he'd done. Dante said a few words in Italian into the phone and hung up. He set it on the desk and looked at her without expression, and asked what she was talking about. Nora said the hospital had just called, that someone had paid the full cost of her mother's surgery, $250,000, and that the transfer had come from Moretti Holdings. Dante neither denied nor confirmed it. He just sat there, watching her with those same cold gray eyes. Nora went on, saying she didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to thank him. She'd pay back every dollar, even if it took her whole life, she promised. Her voice broke, and she had to pause to breathe. Dante stood and walked around the desk to stand in front of her. He was nearly a head taller than her, the distance between them less than a meter. He said in a low, cold voice that she owed him, and he always collected what he was owed. Nora nodded and said she understood. She'd do anything. Dante tilted his head and asked anything. Nora swallowed, realizing how that sounded, but she still nodded. She said her mother was everything she had in this world, and if owing him meant her mother could live, she was willing to accept it. Dante watched her in silence for a long moment. Then something changed in his eyes, just for a second, but Nora saw it. Beneath the icy surface, there was a flicker of warmth, something close to understanding. Dante said she should go to the hospital to be with her mother. She was off today, and Dr. Chen would perform the surgery at 7 the next morning, and she should be there. Nora blinked in surprise and asked about work. Dante turned back toward his desk and said work could wait. Her mother couldn't. Nora stood there a few seconds longer, not knowing what to say. Finally, she managed only 2 words. "Thank you." Her voice a whisper full of emotion. Dante didn't turn to look at her. He just waved a hand to dismiss her. Nora walked out of the office and closed the door behind her. Her heart was still pounding wildly. She didn't understand why a ruthless mafia boss would do this for her. But one thing she knew for certain was that from this moment on, Dante Moretti was no longer just her terrifying employer. He'd become the man who saved her mother's life, and that was a debt she'd never forget. Nora's mother's surgery was successful the next morning. Dr. Samuel Chen said they'd removed the tumor and that Catherine would need time to recover, but the outlook was very good. Nora cried right there in the hospital corridor, this time tears of happiness. She returned to work on the 3rd day after the operation, and everything seemed to be settling down until Dante called her into his office on Friday afternoon and told her she'd be accompanying him to a family dinner at the Moretti estate that evening. Nora's mouth fell open and she asked why she had to go. Dante replied in a tone that allowed no argument that she had to be in his sight 24/7 and he couldn't miss dinner with his grandmother. Nora wanted to protest, but she remembered the $250,000 debt and nodded silently. At 6 that evening, a glossy black Mercedes pulled up in front of Nora's shabby Brooklyn apartment. She stepped out in the only decent black dress she owned, the one she'd bought on a 70% discount 3 years earlier. Dante sat in the back seat, looked her over from head to toe, and said nothing. They drove in silence for 40 minutes, until the Mercedes stopped in front of a massive mansion on Long Island. Nora stepped out and had to tilt her head back to take in the building. It had at least 3 stories, white marble columns, stained glass windows, and a garden as large as her entire neighborhood. She whispered whether this was a house or a palace. Dante didn't answer, only placed a hand on her back and gently guided her toward the front door. Inside, the mansion was even more extravagant. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, old paintings on the walls that Nora guessed each cost as much as her apartment. A young man appeared from the living room and came over to greet them. He was about 28, handsome, with thick black hair and a mischievous smile. He looked Nora up and down, whistled, and told Dante his big brother had finally learned how to choose a secretary. Dante shot him a sharp look and introduced him as Leo, his brother, and said she should ignore everything he said. Leo grinned and introduced himself as the best-looking member of the Moretti family and the only one who still knew how to have fun. Nora couldn't help letting out a small laugh. Leo seemed much easier than his cold older brother, but her smile faded when a deep, commanding female voice came from the staircase asking who that was. Nora looked up and saw an elderly woman descending the stairs. She was about 70, still regal with silver hair and a tight bun, a dark red velvet gown, and eyes sharp as blades that seemed to cut through everything. Dante introduced her as his grandmother, Rosa Moretti, and this was Nora Sullivan, his new secretary. Rosa stepped closer and looked Nora up and down with open disdain. She asked coldly if that was the best dress she had. Nora felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't lower her eyes. She answered, "Yes, ma'am. It was the best dress she had, and she'd bought it for $23 at a 70% sale." Rosa raised an eyebrow and commented that at least the girl knew how to save money. They moved into the dining room, where a long table was set with shining porcelain and silver. Nora sat beside Dante, opposite Leo, and Rosa took the head of the table like a queen on her throne. Dinner began with appetizers and Rosa's probing questions about Nora's family, education, and work. Nora answered each honestly, without trying to decorate or hide anything. Rosa seemed surprised by her bluntness, but kept her displeased expression. With the main course, a servant poured red wine for everyone. When he reached Nora, she accidentally reached for her napkin just as he tilted the bottle, and the entire glass of wine spilled over Rosa's dark red velvet dress. The room froze. Leo's mouth fell open. Dante closed his eyes as if praying. The servant stumbled back in horror. Rosa looked down at her expensive dress, now blotched with dark stains, then up at Nora with a gaze that could kill. Nora wanted the floor to swallow her, but she knew apologizing would be useless. Instead, she met Rosa's eyes and said she was sorry about the dress, But honestly, that shade of dark red was a bit outdated, and maybe this was a sign she should buy a new one. A deadly silence stretched for 5 seconds. Leo stared at Nora, as if she'd just signed her own death warrant. Dante opened his eyes and looked at her with an unreadable expression. Then something no one expected happened. Rosa Moretti laughed. Not a thin or mocking laugh, but a real one that rang through the dining room and left both Leo and Dante stunned. Rosa said it was the first time in 30 years anyone had dared tell her she was outdated. She looked at Nora differently now, with something close to respect. She added that the girl had guts, and she liked that. Leo leaned toward Dante and whispered where he'd found this one. Dante didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted for just a fleeting moment. 3 days after the family dinner, Nora was sitting at her desk organizing the meeting schedule when the elevator doors opened, and a woman stepped onto the 32nd floor. Nora looked up and had to fight the urge to stare. The woman was so beautiful she looked as if she'd stepped straight off a fashion magazine cover. She was tall, with perfectly waved golden hair, flawless pale skin, and blue eyes cold as a winter lake. The red dress she wore probably cost more than Nora's entire year's salary, and her red-soled Louboutins clicked against the marble floor as she walked toward Dante's office. Nora stood and politely asked if she had an appointment with Mr. Moretti. The woman stopped and looked Nora up and down as if she were an irritating insect. She asked who Nora was. Nora replied that she was Nora Sullivan, Mr. Moretti's secretary, and how could she help? The woman gave a disdainful laugh and introduced herself as Serena Cross, and said she didn't need an appointment to see Dante because they had a special relationship that a little secretary didn't need to know about. Nora kept her face calm even though inside she wanted to punch that perfect face. She said that no matter how special the relationship, Mr. Moretti was in a meeting and Serena could schedule an appointment if she wished. Serena narrowed her eyes and stepped closer, expensive perfume flooding the air. She said she'd heard Dante had a new secretary and she wanted to see what little mouse was trying to sneak into her territory. Serena went on that she and Dante had been together for 2 years, and their families had arranged an engagement long ago. So no matter how pretty or tempting Nora was, she was only a temporary secretary, and Serena was the one who would become Mrs. Moretti. Nora smiled sweetly and replied that she had no intention of becoming Mrs. Moretti because she was only here to work and pay off a debt. And if Serena was so worried about her position that she had to come down and threaten a poor secretary, then maybe that position wasn't as secure as she thought. Serena went pale and her voice turned icy as she said she'd make Nora regret that. Just then, Dante's office door opened and he stepped out with 2 men in suits. Dante saw Serena, and his expression didn't change. No pleasure, no annoyance, just complete indifference. Serena immediately changed her manner, beamed, and went to cling to Dante's arm, as if they were still a couple. She said she'd missed him so much she had to come by and asked if they could have dinner together that night. Dante gently but firmly removed her hand and said he was busy. Then he turned to Nora and asked when the next meeting was. Nora said 2 in the afternoon with the legal team. Dante nodded and went back into his office without another word to Serena. Serena stood there with her smile frozen, humiliation plain in her eyes. She turned to Nora with a look full of hatred and said softly that she'd remember Nora's face. Then she spun on her heel and stalked into the elevator, her heels striking the floor in anger. Nora let out a breath and wondered who she'd just made an enemy of. She didn't know that Serena Cross wasn't the kind of person who forgot a humiliation, and she was already beginning to plan her revenge. 1 week after her encounter with Serena, Nora was clearing her desk at the end of the day when she discovered a folder that had been mistakenly clipped into her green-coated files. She was about to return it to accounting when her eyes accidentally skimmed the contents, and she froze in place. It was a copy of money transfers from an anonymous account to a shell company called Benedetti Enterprises. The amounts weren't large, only a few $1,000s each time, but they were regular, once a week for the past 6 months. Nora remembered the name Benedetti from the night she'd witnessed Dante interrogating the traitor. This was the rival family Marco had warned her about. She flipped to the next page and saw the approval signature on those transactions belonged to Marcus Sterling, the chief financial officer of Moretti Holdings. Nora knew she should take this straight to Dante, but she also knew that a single misplaced file wasn't enough proof to accuse a senior executive. She needed more information. She needed to be sure before she spoke, so instead of reporting it, Nora began a quiet investigation. She spent the next 3 days watching Marcus Sterling, noting his habits, the secret phone calls he made in empty meeting rooms, the nights he stayed late after everyone else had gone. On the 4th day, Nora decided she needed to get into Sterling's office to find more evidence. She knew it was reckless. She knew that if she were caught, she wouldn't just lose her job, she might lose her life. But she thought of Dante, who'd spent $250,000 to save her mother without asking anything in return. She couldn't let him be betrayed right under his nose and do nothing. At 10 that night, Nora returned to the Moretti Holdings building. She told security she'd forgotten her phone on her desk, and they let her in because they recognized her. She took the elevator to the 28th floor where the senior executives' offices were. The corridor was dark and empty, lit only by the blinking green glow of the emergency exit sign at the far end. Her heart pounded as she crept to Marcus Sterling's door. She tried the handle and was surprised to find it unlocked. She pushed it open and used her phone flashlight to see. Sterling's office was suspiciously neat, as if he were deliberately leaving no trace of anything. Nora searched the drawers, checked the filing cabinets, even looked under the desk. Nothing. She was about to give up when her foot brushed against a section of carpet that felt slightly raised. She bent down, lifted the rug, and found a small safe recessed into the floor. She was trying to guess the code when the light suddenly snapped on. Nora turned and the blood in her veins turned to ice. Marcus Sterling stood in the doorway, a gun in his hand aimed straight at her. Sterling said coldly that he knew someone had been watching him for days, and he hadn't expected it to be Dante's little secretary. Nora slowly stood, her hands raised. She tried to keep her voice steady and asked how much he was being paid to sell information to Benedetti. Sterling sneered and said enough to let him disappear and start a new life somewhere far away, but unfortunately she wouldn't live to tell anyone about it. He raised the gun, and Nora closed her eyes, thinking of her mother, of her cat Biscuit, of Dante's cold face she'd never see again. A gunshot rang out, but Nora felt no pain. She opened her eyes and saw Marcus Sterling on the floor, blood spilling from his right shoulder, his gun knocked out of reach. In the doorway stood Dante Moretti, his face icy, smoke still rising from the gun in his hand. Behind him was Marco with an expression that looked ready to kill. Dante stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving Nora while Marco moved to restrain Sterling. He asked in a voice so dangerous it made Nora shiver what she thought she was doing. Nora swallowed and said she was trying to find proof of the traitor. Dante stepped closer, until only inches separated them, and said slowly that she'd nearly died for it. Nora met his gaze and said she couldn't let him be betrayed and do nothing, not after everything he'd done for her. Dante studied her for a long moment, that gray gaze holding something she couldn't read. Finally, he turned to Marco and ordered him to take Sterling away and prepare a private conversation with him. Then he took Nora by the arm and pulled her out of the office, his voice still cold but his grip on her strangely warm. Dante didn't take Nora back to her Brooklyn apartment but drove straight to his townhouse on the Upper East Side. Nora was too exhausted and too shaken to protest. She sat silently in the back seat the whole way, staring out the window without really seeing anything. Her hands were still trembling, and only then did she notice a small cut on her forehead, probably from hitting the corner of the desk when Marcus Sterling had lunged at her. Dante's townhouse was smaller than the family estate on Long Island, but still so elegant it made Nora feel out of place. He led her into the living room and told her to sit on the sofa while he went to get a first aid kit. Nora sat there, looking around at the expensive paintings and antique furniture, wondering how her life had turned into this, sitting in a mafia boss's house close to midnight. Dante came back with the kit and sat beside her. He didn't speak, only gently tilted her face toward the light so he could see the wound clearly. Nora held her breath when his fingers touched her skin, the touch warm and unexpectedly gentle compared to his cold exterior. Dante cleaned the cut with an alcohol swab, and Nora inhaled sharply at the sting. He paused for a second, then continued more carefully. As he placed the bandage on her forehead, Nora asked softly why he'd been there at exactly the right moment. Dante said he had someone watching her 24/7, as he'd said, and when they reported she'd gone back to the building at 10 at night, he knew something was wrong. Nora lowered her head and whispered that she was sorry for acting recklessly. Dante finished bandaging her and sat back, but he didn't get up and leave as Nora expected. Instead, he stared into the space ahead and began to speak in a low, distant voice that his mother had been as stubborn as she was. Nora looked up at him in surprise. This was the first time Dante had ever mentioned his mother. He went on to say she never listened to anyone, not even his father, and always did what she thought was right, no matter the consequences. He paused, then added that she'd been killed when he was 14, by the Benedetti family, right in front of him. Nora felt her heart tighten. She didn't know what to say, so she just listened. Dante said that from that day on he'd sworn he'd never let anyone he cared about suffer the same fate, and that was why he'd been angry when she'd taken such a risk. Nora asked softly if that meant he cared about her. Dante turned to look at her, and for the first time those gray eyes weren't cold as ice. He didn't answer the question, only said she should rest. There was a spare bed in the living room, and in the morning he'd take her home. He stood and walked toward the stairs but stopped on the first step. Without turning back, he added that she'd done well finding Marcus, and that he owed her a thank you. Then he went upstairs and disappeared into the darkness. Nora sat there alone, her heart beating wildly, realizing that something had shifted between them that night. The wall of ice Dante had built over so many years had developed a small crack, and Nora wasn't sure whether she should be afraid of that or hope for it. 1 week after the night at Dante's townhouse, Nora was leaving the hospital after visiting her mother when a familiar figure stepped into her path right in front of the gate. She froze when she recognized him, Tyler Brooks, the man who had been with her for 4 years and then disappeared with $70,000 of her savings. He looked more worn than the last time she'd seen him, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, clothes wrinkled as if he'd been wearing them for days. Tyler stepped closer and called her name in a pleading voice, asking her to please let him explain. Nora took a step back and asked coldly what there was left to explain after he'd taken all her money and vanished like a coward. Tyler said he'd been wrong. He knew he'd been wrong, but he'd had no choice. Someone had forced him, and he'd paid it all back. He held out a thick envelope and said it was $70,000. He'd done everything he could to gather it. He begged her to forgive him and give him a second chance. Nora looked at the envelope, and then at Tyler's face. A part of her wanted to believe him because they'd had 4 years together, and she'd once thought it was real love. But before she could speak, a familiar black Mercedes pulled up to the curb and Dante Moretti stepped out. He walked straight toward them, his eyes icy as he looked at Tyler with open contempt. Dante said in a low, dangerous voice that Tyler Brooks should leave right now if he wanted to keep his legs intact. Tyler went pale when he realized who was standing in front of him, but he still tried to hold his ground and said this was between him and Nora and had nothing to do with outsiders. Dante let out a cold laugh and turned to Nora, asking if she wanted to know the truth about this perfect boyfriend. Nora looked at him, then at Tyler, her heart tightening with a bad feeling, and she nodded. Dante pulled a thin file from inside his jacket and handed it to her, saying it was the result of the investigation Marco had completed 3 weeks earlier. Nora opened the file and began to read, and with every line her face grew paler. Tyler Brooks wasn't his real name. His real name was Tyler Benedetti, a distant cousin of Victor Benedetti, the head of the rival family. He'd been assigned to approach Nora 4 years earlier, not for love but because of her father. Patrick Sullivan, Nora's father, had been a chief accountant working for the Moretti family 15 years ago. He'd discovered evidence of Benedetti laundering money through legitimate companies and had intended to report it to Lorenzo Moretti, Dante's father. But before he could do so, Benedetti had acted. The robbery the police had told her mother about hadn't been random. It had been a targeted assassination. When Nora reached that part, her knees buckled and Dante caught her before she fell. Tyler stepped back, his face white as paper, no longer trying to deny anything. Nora looked at him through tears and asked in a trembling voice whether the last 4 years had all been lies. Tyler lowered his head and didn't answer, and his silence hurt more than any confession. Nora asked if he'd known about her father's death, if he'd known and still come to her pretending to love her. Tyler finally looked up, his eyes red, and said he hadn't known at first. He'd only been told to get close to her to see if her family still had any documents about Benedetti, but later he'd truly fallen in love with her. Nora gave a bitter laugh and asked if that love was why he'd stolen her money and left when she needed him most. Tyler had no answer. Dante signaled to Marco, who was already waiting by the car, and told him to take Tyler away. Marco grabbed Tyler's arm and dragged him toward a black van parked at the corner. Tyler struggled and shouted and begged, but Nora didn't turn to look. She stood there with the file still clutched in her hand, tears running down her face. Everything she'd believed in for 4 years revealed as lies. Her first love and arrangement, her father not the victim of a random robbery, but murdered by the very people who'd sent Tyler to her. And Dante said nothing. He just stood beside her, silent and solid like a wall, letting her know she wasn't alone in this darkest moment. In the days that followed, Nora became a completely different person. She still came to work on time, still did her job perfectly, but the light in her eyes was gone. She no longer answered, teasing with humor, no longer smiled when Leo dropped by the office with a joke, no longer looked at Dante with the same curious gaze as before. She worked like a machine, spoke in an even, emotionless tone, and left the moment her hours were done without looking back. Dante noticed the change from the first day. He found himself missing the clumsy girl who'd once spilled coffee on files and dared to tell him he was outdated. He missed her defiant eyes when she answered Serena, her smile when she made Rosa laugh, her recklessness when she'd broken into Sterling's office to protect him. Nora Sullivan now was only the shell of that person. 5 days after the incident with Tyler, Dante called Nora into his office and told her he was taking her somewhere. Nora didn't ask where, only nodded and followed him down to the parking garage. She sat silently in the back seat the whole way, staring out the window without really seeing anything. When the car stopped in front of Brooklyn Presbyterian Hospital, Nora finally looked up in surprise. Dante said her mother was recovering well and had been moved to rehabilitation that day, and he thought she should visit her. Nora wanted to refuse but couldn't find a reason. She went into the hospital with Dante and walked to her mother's room. Catherine Sullivan was propped up on pillows, her face still pale, but her eyes much brighter than the last time Nora had seen her. When she saw her daughter, she smiled and held out her hand. Nora went to the bed and let her mother take her hand. Catherine looked at her daughter, then at Dante in the doorway, and said in a weak but warm voice that the doctor had told her about the person who'd paid for the surgery, and she didn't know how to thank him. Dante nodded politely and said she didn't need to thank him. He only wanted her well, so Nora could work with peace of mind. Catherine smiled and said her daughter was lucky to have met him. Nora said nothing, just sat with her mother and listened to her talk about her days in the hospital. But when Catherine began to mention Nora's father, memories of when he was alive, Nora felt the wall she'd built over the last 5 days start to crack. She excused herself to get water and stepped out of the room. Dante followed her. Nora didn't go to the vending machine. She walked straight to the parking lot, to the Mercedes, and sat in the back seat. She sat there in the dark, her hands clenched on her lap, trying to hold back the flood of feeling rising inside her. Dante opened the door and sat beside her. He didn't speak, didn't ask if she was all right, didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He just sat there, silent and patient, and that silence broke Nora completely. She began to cry, not loud sobs, but quiet tears running down her cheeks, with soft choking sounds she tried to suppress. She cried for her father's unjust death. She cried for 4 years of deception. She cried because she'd been alone for so long without knowing it. In the darkness of the car, a warm hand gently took hers. Dante said nothing, only held her hand and let her cry. And for the first time in many days, Nora felt she wasn't entirely alone. The intimate moment in the car that day changed something between Nora and Dante. In the days that followed, she began to open up a little, sometimes even smiling faintly when Dante said something dry that she found funny. But Serena Cross was watching everything from a distance, and what she saw made her burn with jealousy. Serena knew she was losing Dante to a poor little secretary, and she wasn't going to let that happen. She spent 2 weeks crafting a perfect plan. Through her connections in high society, Serena contacted someone in the Benedetti family and bribed an IT employee at Moretti Holdings. She created a series of fake emails from Nora's personal address to an anonymous account linked to Benedetti, filled with confidential information about ongoing deals. She also forged transfer receipts from Benedetti into a bank account in the name of Nora Sullivan. Every detail was so perfect. Even experts would have trouble telling real from fake. One Monday morning, Marco walked into Dante's office with a face dark as a storm cloud. He put a thick folder on the desk and said he'd just received this information from an internal source and Dante needed to see it immediately. Dante opened the folder, and his face hardened page by page. The emails, the receipts, the evidence that seemed impossible to deny that Nora Sullivan had been selling information to Benedetti for weeks. Marco added that he didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was too clear, and they needed to deal with it before the damage spread further. Dante sat in silence for a long minute, his gray eyes fixed on the pages. Then he ordered Nora to be called in. Nora walked into the office with a faint smile, but it vanished when she saw Dante's and Marco's faces. Dante tossed the folder onto the desk in front of her and said in an icy voice that she should explain. Nora picked it up and began to read, and with every page her face grew paler with shock and disbelief. These were emails she'd never written, money she'd never received, contacts she'd never made. Someone had framed her perfectly. She looked up at Dante and saw doubt in his eyes. Not anger or hatred, but doubt, as if he were waiting for her to prove these things wrong. But suddenly Nora felt exhausted. She'd been through too much in the past weeks. She'd lost her father to this mafia war, been betrayed by the man she'd loved for 4 years, nearly died trying to protect Dante. And now, after all that, he could still doubt her. Nora set the folder down and said in a strangely calm voice that if he believed this after everything that had happened between them, she had nothing to explain. Dante frowned and said he hadn't said he believed it, he only wanted her explanation. Nora shook her head and said no. If he needed her to explain, that meant he already doubted her, and she was too tired to prove her loyalty to people who didn't trust her. She turned and walked toward the door. Dante stood and called her name, but Nora didn't stop. She opened the door and stepped out, leaving Dante standing there with the folder in his hand, and an expression that for the first time Marco saw looked something like confusion. Nora stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and only when the doors closed did she allow herself to cry. Nora left the Moretti Holdings building without looking back. She walked along the sidewalk with no real destination, only wanting to get away from everything, She didn't realize that a black van had been following her since she'd stepped out the front doors. When she turned into a deserted alley to take a shortcut to the subway station, the van accelerated and stopped right in front of her. The doors flew open, and 2 large men jumped out. Nora tried to turn and run, but it was too late. One hand clamped over her mouth while another locked around her neck from behind. She struggled, but her strength was nothing compared to 2 professionally trained men. A sharp chemical smell flooded her nose, and the world slid into darkness. When Nora woke up, she found herself sitting on a wooden chair, her hands bound tightly behind her back, her ankles chained to the chair legs. The room looked like an abandoned warehouse. Gray concrete walls, no windows, only a single ceiling bulb casting a sickly yellow light. Her head pounded and her throat was dry. She tried to wriggle to loosen the ropes, but it was useless. The metal door at the far end opened and a man walked in. He was about 42, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair slicked back, angular features, and black eyes cold as a snake's. He wore an expensive gray suit and black leather gloves. Nora knew instantly this wasn't an ordinary man. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, introducing himself in a voice low and frighteningly gentle as Victor Benedetti, and saying he was very pleased to meet the daughter of Patrick Sullivan. Nora felt her blood turn to ice at the name, Benedetti, the head of the rival family, the man who'd killed Dante's mother, the man who might have ordered her father's death. Victor smiled at her reaction and said he saw she'd heard of him. Good. That saved time. He asked her gently how much Dante Moretti trusted her, what she knew about his deals, his shipping routes, his guards. Nora met his gaze and said she was only a secretary. She arranged meetings and made coffee. She knew nothing about those things. Victor nodded slowly and signaled to one of the men by the door. The man stepped forward and slapped Nora so hard she saw stars. Victor said in the same mild tone that he didn't like violence, but he didn't like being lied to, and he knew she was closer to Dante than an ordinary secretary. Nora spat blood onto the floor and said she knew nothing. The next 2 hours were hell. They hit her, slapped her, even shocked her with electricity. But Nora told them nothing, not because she was loyal to Dante after he doubted her, but because she truly didn't know what they wanted. She was only a secretary, even if she was a secretary who'd seen too much. When Victor began to lose patience, he decided to try another tactic. He told his men to stop and sat down in front of her again. He said, "Did she know?" He'd met her father, Patrick Sullivan, 15 years ago. Nora lifted her head, her eyes wide, though one was swollen shut from the blows. Victor went on that Patrick had been a smart man, too smart for his own good, that he'd discovered things he shouldn't have and planned to report them to Lorenzo Moretti. Victor added that he'd had no choice but to deal with the problem before it became more serious. Nora felt her heart constrict as she asked in a trembling voice what he'd done to her father. Victor smiled coldly and said he'd pulled the trigger himself, and he could say Patrick had died very quickly, almost without pain. That was the mercy he'd given a respectable man. Nora screamed and thrashed wildly, the ropes cutting into her wrists until they bled, but she didn't care. She wanted to tear this man apart. She wanted to kill him with her own hands. Victor stood and told her to calm down. If she cooperated, maybe he'd let her die quickly like her father. But if not, he had plenty of time and plenty of ways to make her suffer. As Victor turned away, Nora realized something. The old phone she always kept hidden in her bra for emergencies was still there. They hadn't searched her thoroughly. With scraped and shaking fingers, she tried to reach behind her back and find the phone. She'd already switched on the recorder before they noticed. Every word of Victor Benedetti's confession about killing her father was now recorded. Now she only had to survive long enough to use it. While Nora was being held in the warehouse, Dante sat in his office, staring at the folder of evidence Marco had given him. Something was wrong. He'd seen Nora's eyes when she'd faced death in Victor Chen's office. He'd felt her sincerity when she'd cried in the car that day. He knew she was willing to risk her life to protect him. A person like that couldn't be a spy. He called Marco in and ordered him to reinvestigate everything from the beginning to find the true source of that evidence. It took Marco 6 hours to trace it back. The bribed IT employee confessed everything under questioning. Serena Cross was behind it all. She'd created every piece of fake evidence, contacted Benedetti to frame Nora, and most importantly, she'd told Benedetti that Nora had left the building alone without protection. Dante felt his blood boil when he heard this. He stood and went straight to Serena's apartment on the Upper East Side. When Serena opened the door with a triumphant smile, he grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the wall. He asked in a voice cold as ice where Nora was. Serena tried to deny it at first, but when she looked into Dante's eyes, she knew she'd gone too far. Trembling, she confessed that Benedetti had taken Nora and brought her to an old warehouse at the Newark docks where they interrogated traders. Dante released her and turned away without another word. He called Marco and ordered all their people assembled within 20 minutes. This wasn't a routine job. This was war. 45 minutes later, 3 black SUVs stopped 500 meters from the warehouse. Dante stepped out first, dressed in a black suit, a loaded pistol in his hand, his eyes cold as frozen hell. Marco and 15 others followed, all heavily armed. They moved through the darkness, approaching the warehouse from 3 different directions. Inside, Victor Benedetti was still interrogating Nora. She was nearly unconscious from pain and blood loss, but she still hadn't said a word. Victor was raising his hand to signal his men to continue when gunfire exploded outside. The metal door was blown open and smoke poured in. Everything descended into chaos. Gunshots echoed, screams, bodies hitting the concrete floor. Dante charged into the crossfire, his eyes scanning the room for Nora. One of Benedetti's men rushed him, and Dante shot him between the eyes without breaking stride. He saw Victor trying to drag Nora toward the back door like a human shield. Dante raised his gun and fired a precise shot into Victor's shoulder, making him release Nora and fall to the floor. Marco and the others subdued the remaining men, the gunfire thinning and then stopping. Dante rushed to where Nora lay on the cold concrete, his heart clenched at the sight of her. Her face was swollen and bruised, her lips cracked and bleeding, one eye nearly shut, her arms and legs marked with burns and cuts. She was almost unrecognizable. Dante knelt beside her and gently lifted her head. He called her name in a trembling voice, the first time Marco had ever heard Dante's voice shake. Nora slowly opened her eyes, her warm brown eyes now full of pain, but still lighting with recognition when she saw him. She whispered weakly that he'd come. Dante gathered her into his arms, not caring that her blood soaked into his expensive suit, not caring about the men watching around them. He said brokenly that he was sorry. Sorry for doubting her. Sorry for failing to protect her. Sorry for everything she'd suffered. Nora lifted a trembling hand and touched his face, whispering that he'd come. That was all that mattered. Then she lost consciousness in his arms. Dante carried her out of the warehouse, his voice sharp as steel, ordering that Dr. Samuel Chen be called to the mansion immediately and everything prepared. Before getting into the car, he turned to Marco and said to keep Victor Benedetti alive. He had special plans for him. Marco nodded in understanding. On the drive back to the mansion, Dante held Nora in his arms the entire way, his hand gently stroking her hair, while his eyes burned with hatred and resolve. He swore that no one would ever be allowed to hurt her again, and that those who had done this would pay dearly. Nora woke in an unfamiliar room with soft light filtering through cream-colored curtains. Her body ached everywhere and her head felt heavy, as if a stone were pressing down on it. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain ran along her side and she groaned. A familiar voice beside her told her to stay still and not try to move. Nora turned her head and saw Dante sitting in the chair by her bed, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his jaw rough with stubble, and his suit still marked with her dried blood. She asked hoarsely how long she'd been asleep. Dante said 3 days, and Dr. Chen said she was lucky because none of her injuries would cause permanent damage. Nora closed her eyes, and the memories of the warehouse rushed back like a nightmare. Victor Benedetti, the confession that he'd killed her father, the recording on the phone hidden in her bra. She opened her eyes again and asked Dante about her phone. Dante held up the old device and said the doctor had found it during the examination, and he'd listened to the recording. He looked at her with a complicated expression and added that she'd done what his entire investigative team hadn't managed in 15 years. She'd gotten a direct confession from Victor Benedetti about killing her father and about many other crimes. The door opened and Rosa Moretti came in, followed by Marco. Nora was surprised to see that the old woman's gaze was no longer cold as it had been the first time they met, but held genuine concern instead. Rosa came to the bed and took Nora's hand, saying in a low, warm voice that she was sorry for what had happened to her, that she'd misjudged her, and that she was grateful Nora hadn't revealed anything even under torture. Marco stood behind her and bowed his head, saying he was sorry too for doubting her, and that he should have investigated more carefully before bringing those false documents to Dante. Nora smiled weakly and said she didn't blame anyone because the evidence had been too perfect and anyone in their place would have doubted. Rosa patted her hand gently, then signaled Marco to leave, saying Dante should stay with her. When the door closed, Dante stood and sat on the edge of the bed, closer to Nora. He was silent for a moment, then said in a low, steady voice that he'd lived in the dark for too long, built his walls too high so no one could reach him, and he'd thought that was safety. But when he'd seen her lying broken in that warehouse, he'd realized the walls hadn't protected him from anything. They'd only made him lonelier. He looked straight into Nora's eyes and said she was the first light he'd seen after many years in the dark, and he didn't want to lose her. Nora felt her heart race. She lifted her hand and touched Dante's face and whispered that he wasn't completely dark. He'd just forgotten how to step into the light. Dante leaned down until his forehead touched hers, his warm breath brushing her lips. He whispered and asked if he could. Nora didn't answer with words. She gently pulled him closer and their lips met. The kiss was soft and tender, unhurried, not demanding, just two wounded souls finding a way to heal in each other. When they parted, Dante rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he'd protect her. He swore. Nora smiled and replied that maybe this time they should protect each other. 2 weeks after their first kiss, Nora had almost fully recovered. The bruises on her face had faded. Her cracked rib had healed, and she could walk normally again. But one thing still hadn't healed, the wound inside her from knowing that the man who'd killed her father was still alive, even if he was locked in the basement of the Moretti estate. And one evening when Dante called a meeting with Marco and his closest advisors to decide what to do with Victor Benedetti, Nora was in the living room reading when she heard the argument drifting out of the meeting room. She stood up and walked straight in without asking permission. Everyone turned to look at her, but she didn't care. She looked straight at Dante and said she wanted to be part of it. Dante frowned and said this wasn't her concern and she should rest. But Nora shook her head and said Victor Benedetti had killed her father 15 years ago, had destroyed her life before she'd even realized it, and she had the right to see him answer for it. This was her business, more than anyone else's in that room. The room fell silent. Marco looked at Dante, waiting, and Dante studied Nora for a long moment before nodding and pulling out a chair for her. The meeting continued and Nora listened to their plan. Dante intended to deal with Victor in the traditional Mafia way. Quick, clean, no trace. But Nora stood and said she had the recording of Victor's confession about killing her father and many other crimes. A recording strong enough to put him in prison for life, and she proposed sending it to the FBI instead of killing him themselves. Dante asked why she'd want that when he could avenge her faster. And Nora said she wanted Victor to die in prison as a criminal, not as a warrior in a Mafia war. She wanted the world to know he was a murderer, not just a boss eliminated by a rival. And more importantly, if Dante killed Victor himself, he'd be trapped forever in a cycle of revenge. Another family would rise to replace Benedetti, and the war would never end. But if Victor was arrested by the FBI with full evidence, the Benedetti family would collapse from the inside and Dante could walk out of the underworld once and for all. Marco objected that working with the FBI was dangerous because they might turn their investigation on Moretti. But Nora said she'd thought of that, and that she'd be the one to send the evidence as Patrick Sullivan's daughter. With no link to Moretti Holdings, and the recording contained only Victor's confession, with nothing about Dante or his family. Dante was silent, thinking, then looked at her and asked if she was sure because once the evidence was sent, there'd be no taking it back. And Nora nodded and said she'd never been more sure of anything. And 3 days later, an unmarked envelope arrived at the FBI office in Manhattan, containing a USB with a 43-minute recording in which Victor Benedetti confessed to at least 12 murders, including Patrick Sullivan, 3 major money laundering operations, and many other crimes. It took the FBI 2 weeks to verify it and prepare the warrants. And on an ordinary Tuesday morning, they raided all Benedetti properties across New York. Victor Benedetti was arrested at his Long Island home, handcuffed in front of his family and the press. Alongside him, Tyler Brooks and Marcus Sterling were also formally charged. Using the overwhelming evidence Nora had secured, the court ensured they would exchange their luxury for the cold bars of a prison cell. The image of the infamous boss being led into a police car filled every news channel, and Nora sat in Dante's mansion watching the coverage, silent tears running down her cheeks, while Dante sat beside her holding her hand and asked how she felt. And Nora said she felt lighter, as if a weight she'd carried for 15 years had finally been lifted. Her father could finally rest. And Dante kissed her forehead and whispered that she'd done the right thing and that he was proud of her. The months that followed Victor Benedetti's arrest were the most transformative period in both Nora's and Dante's lives. The Benedetti family collapsed like a sandcastle once its leader was locked behind bars. Senior members were arrested one by one or fled the country, and the criminal empire they'd built over 40 years dissolved in a matter of weeks. Serena Cross, whose family's reputation was shattered by their exposed links to the Benedetti crimes, was stripped of her social standing and wealth. She was forced to flee New York in disgrace, banished forever from the high society circles she once tried to rule with malice. Just as Nora had predicted, no one rose to seek revenge because everyone was too busy saving themselves. Dante kept his promise to her. He began turning Moretti Holdings from an empire tied to the underworld into a fully legitimate corporation. The shadowy operations were gradually cut away, the criminal connections severed, and clean businesses like real estate, fine dining, and luxury hotels became the focus. Marco resisted at first, having grown used to the old ways. But when he saw Dante happier than he'd ever been beside Nora, he came to accept the change. Nora was no longer a secretary. Dante promoted her to creative and communications director of Moretti Holdings, in charge of rebuilding the company's public image. Some whispered she'd been promoted because of her relationship with the boss, but within the first 6 months she proved herself by redesigning the entire branding strategy and helping the company secure 5 major contracts with international partners. Nora's mother recovered fully from the surgery. Catherine could walk normally again and even took up gardening, a hobby she'd abandoned after her husband's death. Dante bought her a new apartment in Brooklyn Heights, brighter and far more spacious than the old shabby one. The first time Catherine met Dante, she took his hands and said she didn't know who he was or what he did, but she knew he'd saved her life and made her daughter happy, and that was enough. Dante and Nora began dating openly. They appeared together at social events, charity galas, and company launches. The press buzzed about the relationship between the enigmatic CEO of Moretti Holdings and the young director from humble origins. Some tabloids tried to dig into Dante's past, but found nothing because all illegal traces had long since been erased. Rosa Moretti now treated Nora like a granddaughter-in-law, even though they weren't officially married. She often invited Nora to the Long Island estate to teach her the family's traditional Italian recipes, and the two women from such different worlds became unexpectedly close friends. Leo never missed a chance to tease his once cold older brother, who now smiled and held his girlfriend's hand like a teenager in first love. Life had finally begun to smile on Nora Sullivan after so many years of hardship. 1 year after Victor Benedetti's arrest, Dante Moretti was honored as Businessman of the Year at the annual awards ceremony of the New York Business Association in recognition of his efforts to transform Moretti Holdings into a transparent, socially responsible corporation and to donate millions of dollars to charitable causes across the city. The gala was held at the Plaza Hotel with more than 300 guests, the most influential business leaders and public figures in New York, and Nora sat in the front row wearing the navy blue dress Dante had chosen for her because he said that color matched her eyes when she smiled. Beside her were Rosa, Leo, Marco, and her mother Catherine. Attending such a grand event for the first time since her recovery, Nora had reviewed Dante's speech the week before and helped him edit a few lines. It was a proper speech about business vision, social responsibility, and innovation, and she'd heard him rehearse it at least 15 times in the office, so she practically knew every word by heart. So when the host invited Dante onto the stage and he began speaking, Nora leaned back and smiled with pride. But about 2 minutes in, Dante suddenly stopped mid-sentence, looked down at the paper in his hand, folded it, and slipped it into his jacket pocket, which made Nora frown because that wasn't in the plan. Dante cleared his throat and said that he'd prepared a very good speech about business strategy and the future of Moretti Holdings. But he'd just realized there was something more important to say tonight. The room fell silent. Nora felt her heart start to race without knowing why. Dante went on to say that 1 year earlier, a clumsy girl with messy hair and a coffee-stained resume had walked into his office and completely turned his world upside down. She'd been 23 minutes late, had lipstick on her teeth, and had dared to tell him he was out of fashion. Light laughter rippled through the hall, and Nora felt her face heat up as a few people turned to look at her. Dante looked straight into her eyes from the stage and continued that she'd taught him leadership wasn't about control but about inspiration, that chaos could sometimes be the best thing that ever happened, and that loving someone was the smartest business decision he'd ever made. The room was utterly silent. Nora felt tears well in her eyes. Dante pulled a small black velvet box from his pocket and stepped down off the stage, walking straight toward Nora, while 300 pairs of eyes followed him. He stopped in front of her and said that Nora Sullivan had turned him from a monster into a man, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her. Then he went down on one knee, or at least he tried to, because his tailored suit was a bit too snug, and as he bent his knee, a very audible rip of fabric echoed through the silent hall. The seam at the back of his trousers had given way. Dante lost his balance and slipped slightly on the red carpet, his knee hitting the floor harder than intended, and he nearly pitched forward if he hadn't caught himself with his hand. The room let out a collective gasp, mixed with laughter. Leo in the row behind laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. Rosa covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook as she tried not to laugh. And Marco stood frozen like a statue, his face bright red as he struggled to keep a serious expression for his boss. Dante remained kneeling at an awkward angle, his face as red as a tomato, but he still held up the velvet box and opened it to reveal a classic solitaire diamond ring sparkling under the lights, and in a voice slightly shaky with embarrassment, he said this wasn't part of the plan, but the question still stood. Nora Sullivan, Would you marry me even after watching me tear my pants in front of 300 people? Nora couldn't hold it in any longer and burst out laughing through her tears, a strange mix of joy and amusement. She stood, stepped in front of Dante, helped him up, and looked straight into his eyes, and said that Dante Moretti was the most charmingly awkward man she'd ever met. And the answer was yes, 1,000,000 times yes. The hall erupted in applause and cheers. Dante slid the ring onto Nora's finger and kissed her in front of 300 witnesses. And when they parted, Nora took the microphone from a nearby attendant and told the room that just so everyone knew he'd rehearsed that speech 15 times in the office and hadn't fallen once. Leo shouted from the back that the video had been recorded and would be played at the wedding, which sent the hall into laughter again. And Dante looked at Nora with an expression that was half embarrassed and half blissful, and whispered that she'd never let him forget this, would she? And Nora smiled and answered that she wouldn't, ever. 2 months after the legendary proposal night at the Plaza Hotel, Dante and Nora held their wedding in a beautiful garden in Central Park on a sunny spring Saturday, with only about 80 guests, including family, close friends, and colleagues who'd walked with them through every rise and fall. Rosa Moretti sat in the front row on the groom's side, wearing the dark blue velvet dress Nora had chosen for her, because Rosa had declared that red dresses were now forbidden after last year's wine incident. Beside her sat Leo, whose official mission was to film the entire ceremony to make sure no humorous disaster went undocumented. Nora's mother sat in the front row on the bride's side with tears already falling before the ceremony even began, and true to tradition for any event involving Nora, the wedding started with a series of unexpected mishaps. First, Dante arrived 5 minutes late because he'd forgotten the rings in the car, and Marco had to sprint back to the parking lot to get them. When the groom finally took his place under the flower arch, the music started, and Nora appeared at the end of the aisle, breathtaking in her white lace gown, holding a bouquet of white roses, her eyes glowing with happiness. But halfway down the aisle, her heel caught in the train of her dress, and she nearly face-planted in front of 80 guests. Thankfully, Marco, standing nearby as best man, caught her just in time. Leo shouted from the seats that he'd got it on video, and Nora could only shake her head and laugh as she continued toward Dante, who was watching her with equal parts worry and love. Father Anthony began the opening words, but halfway through, a bee flew straight into his mouth while he was speaking. The elderly priest coughed and spluttered for a full minute while the entire wedding fought not to laugh. When he finally recovered and continued to the vows, things became even more memorable. Dante looked into Nora's eyes and promised that he'd love her, respect her, and tolerate her reorganizing his files without asking until death did them part. Nora laughed and replied that she'd love him, care for him, and tolerate him checking email over breakfast and wearing overly tight suits that might rip at any moment until death did them part. The guests burst into laughter, and Father Anthony had to wait before he could continue. Rosa cried so hard her mascara streaked down her cheeks while Catherine passed her tissues and cried just as much herself. When Father Anthony declared them husband and wife and Dante kissed Nora, the entire garden erupted in applause. They walked down the aisle between guests, tossing rose petals, and Nora couldn't stop smiling. A year earlier, she'd been a desperate girl with a dying mother, a cheating boyfriend, and not a dollar to her name. Now she was a successful executive, marrying the man she loved and surrounded by people who truly cared about her. As they got into the decorated car, Dante took her hand and said, "Thank you for coming into my life like a storm and teaching me that sometimes the best things come from chaos." Nora kissed him and said, "Thank you for not firing me on the interview day, even though I was 23 minutes late and had lipstick on my teeth." Dante laughed and said, "That was the best decision of his life." The wedding car drove through the busy streets of New York, with tin cans rattling behind it and a sign that read, "Just married." Nora rested her head on Dante's shoulder and looked out the window, thinking about the wild journey that had brought her here. She'd lost her father, been betrayed, kidnapped, and tortured. But she'd also found love, family, and a peace she'd never dared to dream of. Life isn't perfect, and maybe it never will be, but with Dante beside her, she knew she could face anything. The story of Nora and Dante reminds us that true love doesn't come from perfection, but from accepting each other's flaws. That sometimes the worst beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep walking while afraid. And that family isn't only those who share your blood, but those who choose to stand beside you in your darkest moments. If you liked this story, please like and share it with those you love. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next stories. We'd love to know how you felt about Nora and Dante's journey. Have you ever faced hardship and found light where you least expected it? Do you believe love can change a person? Leave a comment from your heart because we read and treasure every one. Thank you for spending your time with us. We wish you and your family health, joy, and peace every day. Goodbye and see you again in our next stories.